your screen. If you find the button at the bottom of your screen, you can access there and choose the language of your preference, either English or Spanish. First of all, I'd like to welcome Peter Bandiero, Forest Officer of the Regional Office of FAU for Latin America and the Caribbean, so that he can provide a few opening remarks on this topic. Go ahead, Peter.
Estimados participantes y
Dear
panelistas,
participants and panelists, first of all, I'd like to greet our panelists, Claudia Matallana, member of the group of specialists of OMEC of the World Commission of Protected Areas, Ambassador Carlos Lassari from the Organization for Amazon Cooperation, the fisher office at FAO office in Rome, Carolina Sofani from the YAPA project, and Marcela Santa Maria from the Colombian Network of an organization that protects areas. Latin America and the Caribbean, one of the regions that is particularly rich, speaking of biodiversity. 7 of the most biodiverse countries in the world. The region hosts 40% of the globe's biodiversity. Speaking of a species, almost 1/4 of the forest worldwide. It also has over 8.8 million square kilometers located in protected areas, both sea and land areas. The greatest amount of these areas is found here. In spite of representing an important axis for social and cultural development, biodiversity is strongly threatened, especially due to human action. Demographic growth, unsustainable consumption, unsustainable practices, and the great demand of resources have destroyed habitats and have endangered thousands of species. As a result of some of these interventions, the ecosystems have not been able to continue to provide their services. The loss of habitats, the arrival of invasive species, the overexploitation of resources, climate change, and contamination are threatening their natural life, and as a result, human life itself. In this task to discuss a new global framework for biodiversity and to serve countries of the world to live in harmony with nature and comply with global treaties such as the 2030 Agenda. Then also the SDGs and the fight against climate change. Then it is imperative to establish more and better strategies to manage and preserve biodiversity. These effective measures to preserve nature based on areas, OMEC, different from protected areas, represent a big opportunity so that countries highlight the
a partir del reconocimiento de una gama más amplia de medidas de gestión de la biodiversidad y primordialmente de poder integrar esfuerzos estratégicas de buena gobernanza de otros factores del territorio. Las OMECs contribuyen a la conservación de ecosistemas importantes.
OMECs contribute to the conservation of important ecosystems, establishing other ecosystems. At the same time, this represents an excellent opportunity to highlight the role of productive systems, agricultural practices, and other sustainable practices, the conservation and sustainability of biodiversity. If we bring together our efforts and we look at the conservation measures, we can contribute not only to safeguard biodiversity, but also to ensure the food security of communities and the sustainable use of natural resources that we depend on, hand in hand with other private stakeholders, others that are not so well recognized in conservation because they play an essential role to protect biodiversity. In that regards, FAO, in response implementation to the decision 14 of COP 14 of the Treaty on Biological Biodiversity wants to support countries in the recognition of ECMO through the promotion of dialogue and regional exchanges, the implementation of projects, and the strengthening of the public policies, and come closer to the environmental sector and the productive sector, bring them together to implement sustainable practices and make contributions to conservation processes and sustainable production that goes along with the implementation of the FAO strategy to the protection of biodiversity in different agricultural sectors. As FAO, recognize the role of these regional cooperation platforms from which we are a part, for example, technical sector, and we play a fundamental role in planning. We support the 2030 agenda through the promotion of agro-food systems in a more efficient manner. They should also be more inclusive, more sustainable to achieve better production, better nutrition, better environment, a better life without leaving anyone behind. I wish you, I'm sorry, to conclude, I wish you an interesting webinar to contribute to a better understanding of the potential, the challenges, and the opportunities of ECMOs. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Peter, por tus palabras. Justamente de eso vamos a hablar
Thank you, Peter,
hoy.
for your kind words. That's precisely what we're going to be talking about today. All these situations that you've mentioned, and they're so important to our region. This is why I'd like to welcome especially the panelists who have joined us today. Ambassador Carlos Lazarin, Executive Director of the Organization of the Cooperation Treaty for the Amazon. Clara Matallana, who has also joined several space dialogues in this regard. She's a member of the specialized group of the World Commission on Protected Areas. We also have with us Hims, fishing official of FAO, our branch in Rome, another technical expert for the protected areas of Amazon by biomass, and also the participation of Marcela Santamaria, who coordinates technically Resnatur, the Colombian network of natural civil society, and coordinator of the project to adapt the criteria of the SOMEC to the ECMO context or guidelines to Colombian context. I want to thank you all for joining us today. We're very pleased to see here participants from Cuba, Ecuador, Peru, Indonesia, Gabon, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, Panama, Chile. It's great to have you with us. Most likely others who have not said where they're from, but it's good to have you all here with us, all our Latin American brothers discussing this important topic. I can tell you that we are streaming this event through FAO's YouTube in www.fao.org/Americas, and then in FAO account in Twitter. You can make your comments in our social media with the hashtag Sustainable Agriculture and COP26. We also invite the attendees to write their questions for the presenters and lecturers in the social media. We'll try to answer them at the end of the webinar. We have very little time for questions, but we'll try to answer to some of them to create more dialogue. Now I'd like to explain the dynamics of the event, and we'll start with a presentation by Clara Matallana, who'll be giving an overview about the identification and report of our ECMO, this big context. Then we'll have Carlos Lazarin, who will be sharing his presentation on the program for the biodiversity for the Amazon basin in the OTCA, and also its relation to this important topic of ECMO. After that, Amber Hims will share with us their experience on the fishing sector or the fisheries sectors, and the ECMO is a very relevant sector for these conservation measures. Then Carolina will be presenting a case study on the identification of ECMO for the Amazon biomass. And finally, we'll have the presentation by Marcela Santamaria, who will be telling us more specifically about the experience of Colombia while applying the criteria to identify ECMO. After that, we'll move on to some time for questions. As I said before, we'll be receiving those questions through the chat box in Zoom where we are connected and the social media. Okay, to get into the subject, Clara Matallana, she's member of the specialist member on protected areas. Clara, you have 15 minutes for your presentation, so go ahead, share with us.
Muchas gracias, Claudia, y muchas gracias.
Thank you, Claudia, and thank you very much, everyone, for helping us today, all the organizers, for helping me present this general context on the OMEC or ECMO. I'm going to share my screen. Please confirm that you can see it.
Sí, creo que ya. Perfecto. Entonces, bueno, como mencionaba Claudia,
okay, as Claudia mentioned before, I'm going to be telling you about some overviews of this topic, where it comes from and how it is applied in the different countries. It's part of other topics. This is very relevant in the discussions that are taking place in the 2020 context. That's why the interest that we can have these spaces and continue to build together in the countries. Is the framework of ECMO is an important step in the recognition of biodiversity beyond protected areas. We always like to tell this example, talk about this example. A point of reference for the conservation is the natural park in Yellowstone. It's considered one of the natural parks that was declared by a government in 1872. It's a pioneer area in conservation. Nonetheless, we know that for a long time ago, many communities had already reserved their spaces for conservation. This is an example of Mongolia, where there's a protected space since 14th century. It was established because it was there are many examples worldwide of those areas that for some reason, they've been preserved for some cultural activities, but also for the conservation of biodiversity. In the strategic framework of biodiversity that was established in 2011, the Ichi Goal 11 was the first time when the term OMEC was introduced. Remember, let's keep in mind that the goal said we had to preserve about 17% of continental areas and 10% of marine areas near coasts through the creation of protected areas, but also you mentioned the term of other effective measures for conservation based on area. So let's say that it was the first time that in a document, CDB, mentioned this term. Last year, when we had the cohort and it was a cut-off day, we wanted to know how much we had advanced in this goal. We saw that worldwide, it was reported 15.53% of land surface as protected and only 8% of marine protected areas. That means the goals that had been set internationally were not achieved during that period. When we mention for this term for the first time in CDB, we begin with a series of discussions internationally and different spaces to bring context to this definition. This graph is only to show you that this it was a process that was very discussed at different technical meetings that allowed since 2016, when we had the first time that there was a workshop on this on the Commission of Protected Areas of IUCN after the request from CB. There are some discussions as what would be the definition for OMEC, what's the criteria to identify these kind of strategies in the territories. Then in February 2019, there were some guidelines from IUCN which allowed establishing what would those areas be. And before that, the COP 14 passed a decision 14.8, which established some guidelines for governments and other organizations so that they may begin to apply this technical knowledge on OMEC. So it adopts a definition, establishes criteria, promotes the identification of OMEC and the different options within the jurisdiction, and it encourages OEMEC for monitoring and conservation so that they are included in the World OEMEC database. It is only OESCM by government, so there's a space in the database for the reports of these initiatives. What I'd like to highlight here is that the term OECM is not a term for the denomination of these areas that already exist, but we see it as an umbrella term that covers different types of conservation strategies, other effective area-based conservation measures. So it's important if there are initiatives with different names, that doesn't mean that if they are recognized as OECM, we're going to change its denomination or they become something else. So it's important to take into account that the definition of OECM that was established through this participatory process that I mentioned shows that OECM is a geographical area. It's not a protected area though, and it's governed and managed in such a way that it can achieve positive results and long-lasting results for the conservation of biological biodiversity. And of course, it includes ecosystemic services associated to it, cultural, spiritual, socioeconomic values, and other relevant values locally. So I think that based on this definition, we move on to other criteria that allow identifying what those areas comply with these features to be considered OECM. So the main differences that were noticed between OECM and protected areas, and we saw them in the discussion the spaces, is that a protected area has a main objective to preserve on biodiversity on site, whereas OECM show effective results for conservation of biodiversity regardless of their status of their objective, whether they're a protected area or not. The objectives could be primary, secondary, or even they could be results of unplanned conservation results areas that were established for very different topics of biodiversity conservation, but it has a effect of conservation on the ecosystems. It's very important to mention also that we have this big number of conservation initiatives worldwide. Some of them may be part of the protected areas, others may be part of the OECM, and at some point in time, some OECM that have conservation objectives may move on to be protected areas if at some point in time the governments establish different categories or for some given reason they are recognized. So here we can see the different types of objectives that the areas may have. And here I show some examples of what could be what those areas could be according to the conservation objectives they have. We see that OECM may attain conservation objectives. Some of them have higher intention to preserve biodiversity. Others have fewer intentions. With greater conservation, we have ICAs or TICAs. These are territories preserved by communities, some international designations, such as the Ramsar locations, biosphere reservations, and as I said, or reserves, others that comply with the protected area definition, but they don't want to be recognized as such. In this case, there's an example in Colombia, and these are the protected areas in municipalities that right now are not recognized by legislation. They are not part of the national system of protected areas, but they comply with the definition. But for the time being, they are being considered as OECM. In areas with secondary conservation objectives, we have areas for the protection of ecosystemic services. So many countries have areas that protect to preserve commercial species, or we also have areas to protect the water resource or also for water uh, for irrigation and so on for the conservation of biodiversity as well. And other areas for subsidiary conservation or unplanned, speaking of biodiversity, we can mention some areas that are not untransformed areas that have some kind of management, some sacred sites of communities, because these are areas that can't be touched. They preserve the ecosystems of those areas. And there's an example, very interesting one. These are the military areas, and even there are other examples at the sea level in areas where there are where ships have sunk or other monuments, war monuments under the sea, and they've been preserved. And thanks to that, it's been an opportunity for the conservation and to restore biodiversity in that area. So as I said, OECM may be very diverse. There could be a wide range of types of strategies that fit in these criteria. 14.8 decision establishes some elements within each criteria. As I said before, the first criteria is that the area is not recognized as a protected area. In case it is recognized as a protected area, then it would not have this denomination of OECM. It's also criteria B is that it's managed and governed. OECM is not an abandoned area that does not have any management authority. It does not have any associated stakeholder for management. And within this criteria, we notice that it has to be geographically limited space. This is a very important point because many times we find that there isn't the cartography or any chart. So the first step is to be able to have a chart. It should be chartered. It should have a legitimate governance authority and some agreement to manage the area. Not necessarily does it have to have a management plan, but there must be an agreement depending on the type of governance so that the area may be managed somehow. Criteria C is important because it means that the area achieves effective conservation of biodiversity. This is a criteria that poses a lot of challenges because many areas still do not have enough studies on the contribution they are making, speaking of biodiversity conservation, but there has to be some sort of indicator to define that the area is producing positive results. In many cases, these are issues of perception. For example, the communities or the stakeholders that are present saying that since the area was established or the management measures that they established, there's been an improvement, but it's important to have, like we said, elements that allow us to define that these are contributions from there. And also the criteria D is functions and services associated to ecosystems. We need to take into account that these areas may have other values. They may be cultural, spiritual, social, economic, or others, and they may be locally relevant. The steps we have suggested for the identification and report of OECM are found here in this ladder. We see there must be a potential identification of OECM, then an analysis of candidate OECM, then many areas will need strengthening of some criteria when the governance is not well structured, or when we see that it's very difficult to establish that they actually produce results, or because the area is not limited, it doesn't have boundaries. So we need to strengthen those areas, then we move on to reporting. And then finally, if it complies with the criteria, it would be included in the world database of OECM. I should mention that OECM, I've mentioned this before, but they may have different types of governance established by IUCN. We have governance by the state, shared with ethnic groups or local communities, and also governance by private parties or private organizations. Why is it important to report OECM to a world database? It allows visualizing the initiatives and take ownership through different decision makers. And in this case, and where we are now at the moment we live, because we can see the contribution to compliance of the international commitments. And a very important reason is the after 2020 framework. It's important to mention that it's not about adding area only, but they must comply with the uh, areas to make sure they are contributing to conservation. The next steps that are suggested with all the international context of OECM is that the countries should hold meetings with government agencies to implement the guidelines. Decision 14.8, in spite of the fact that it establishes criteria, it also provides some flexibility to countries so they can adapt, adopt, and apply. Other stakeholders must be welcome in the process, create an interest for OECM amongst different stakeholders and different skills. And if I say identification of potential OECM, we'll see some examples of that. Establish the necessary steps to identify and strengthen the and report OECM, and then analyze the chance or need to have a support regulatory framework. Some countries have already started to identify and report these initiatives. As we said, we'll see some examples today in Latin America. We've seen there's big potential to identify these initiatives. This was brought up in the Congress on Protected Areas of the Caribbean and Latin America in 2019, the big potential of the region. And we see there's a big opportunity with these initiatives because they recognize conservation outside protected areas. They also allow for a contribution to keeping preserving biodiversity and ecosystem services while increasing representatives and connectivity of the different systems of protected areas. They recognize and welcome stakeholders and different governance models in the conservation networks. They get greater visibility for resource management. Sometimes these are initiatives that already exist, but they need to be seen and visualized more. And that's why we need the reports. And we can also collect more accurate data on these initiatives and quantify these contributions. And also, it contributes to improving sector practices and promote the participation of different stakeholders in conservation, which is something we need now. There are two tools that have been suggested from the Commission of Protected Areas. It's a group of ECM specialists. We have the guidelines in Spanish. You can download it from a UCM website to recognize and report other OECM or effective database conservation measures. It's in English, French, and Spanish, and or Portuguese too. And they're building this document that is to come up with a methodology to identify uh, in situ of these OECM or ECM. It'll be available soon. For further information, if you'd like to check these tools, you can find them at these websites, and also write to this email by the group of specialists if you'd like to have further information. Thank you, and we move on to the next panelist. Thank you, Claudia.
Muchas gracias a ti, Clara, por esa interesante presentación. Como siempre, nos amplías un poco sobre este tema de las
Thank you for
OMECs.
your presentation about OECM. Of course, it raises a lot of questions, and we've seen questions about other areas. We'll try to answer those questions later. Thank you, Clara.
Argentina,
We want to
Paraguay.
welcome our colleagues from Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay, and Guatemala. They've reported they are present in the meeting. Now we welcome Mr. Ambassador Carlos Sarin, Executive Director of the ODCA, who will be talking about this biological program for the Amazon Basin and their relation to this topic of OECM. Go ahead. Thank you. Big welcome to everyone. Very interesting presentation by Clara. I learned some things.
It's
good to be here with our FAO friends. They are strategic allies and partners for always. I think that since the organization started in 2002, but before that with the treaty that was signed in 78. It's always important to remember that the treaty was signed by 8 countries: Bolivia, Brazil, Colombia, Guyana, Ecuador, Peru, Suriname, and Venezuela. And that treaty that's how ODCA came to be. It's based in Brasilia, Brazil, ODCA, ODCA, and it's always been working. First of all, it inherited all the previous work in the context of the treaty, but always keeping the same pillars determined by the treaty. Since then, it took into account the concept I'm talking about years before the Brundtland report, that for the first time it states the concept of sustainable development. Even before that, the formula that was found by the countries was harmonic development of the Amazon, but it has the same context, the same scope, and the same spirit to work on the Amazon issues based on cooperation and more symmetric. Trying always to develop a positive agenda where we want to replicate the good experiences through cooperation mechanisms, especially South-South cooperation, and also with strategic allies, strategic partners outside the region, strategic partners within the UN system. And that's the case of FAO. So the premises of the treaty, they are always to work about common denominators of countries, respecting sovereignty, but also to strengthen public policy that have to do with the Amazon territories. As you may well know, there is an asymmetry of the Amazon territories in relation to the rest of the countries, and that is always reflected on a difficulty to assign funds by the international agencies that work with non-reimbursable funds. The role of ODCA has always been to show that the Amazon must continue to be a priority for the agencies, for the options, and for the priorities. The topic at hand that has gathered us today, that is the protected areas, has always been a concept, an activity that's been present in the agenda of ODCA, our strategic cooperation agenda. It's always been there, and more recently, it's been one of the most important topics that have been included in the recently approved regional program of biodiversity of the Amazon region, approved by everyone, by the 8 countries, and I would say it was emblematic. On the 21st of May was approved, and the 22nd is the World's Day of Biodiversity. I don't say it was coincidence, but we can say it was well planned, it was well rolled out. And we always have this sense of time. We have good timing, as they say in English. So I think it's something that has brought us together. ODCA works, of course, with common denominators. It's a decision process. It's unanimous by 8 countries, and that's not a little thing. I mean, we have achieved in this year, we have approved 4 important documents, but I'm going to go back to mention that these are important documents, and one of them is the program I mentioned. I can tell you that the pillars of ODCA and the work we do at ODCA for sustainable development of course, have to do with forests, water resources. We have a very big agenda in that sense. Also, indigenous peoples, We have always found strategic partners, and now with a program that will be part of the big project that motivates us at OEDCA, that is the Regional Amazon Observatory. And it's not a coincidence. We are going to launch it and start it on November 10th, in just a few days, here in our facilities in Brasilia. So as I said, the four documents that we've approved this year unanimously, they are the regional framework for action for regional action, the framework on biological biodiversity, which I'll discuss later, and the program, the regional program of forests, in addition to the monitoring of fires through an MOU also approved by the 8 countries, and it incorporates a protocol that we worked on in the area of the Leticia Pact. So these are the topics, the important topics that we're working on at ODCA. Speaking of forests, we've made progress, a lot of progress, thanks to the support of the countries, and also with the support of the Amazon Fund and monitoring project in biodiversity. And we've made progress, and also in water resources. There's a holistic approach in other areas related to energy, food, water. It comes together with another holistic approach that is environmental health plus animal health and human health. It's the concept of one health, something we're working on and making progress. The regional global context of our program is that is a decision of the countries to comply with the conservation objectives and sustainable use of biodiversity, fair and equal distribution of the benefits derived from the use of genetic resources, and of course, always keeping in mind a link to national legislation in each member country. This is how we build the program. It's been aligned with the objectives of the agreement, the CBD, the Biodiversity Convention, in the framework that has brought us together here, the 2030 Agenda, of course, the SDGs related to biodiversity, and always our strategic agenda. We are relating these our SDGs to our goals and to our objectives, our ODCA. But we always want to strengthen the capabilities within our organization, because that's key to our actions. We want to strengthen the policies through strengthening the institutions, and we try to use everything that we've heard, for example, in Clara's presentation, so that somehow we take that to the regional dimension and facilitate that all countries have a chance to include those topics of OECM, protected areas, and so on in their national policies and public policies in relation to the Amazon, but also taking advantage and using the experience of countries that are somehow more developed in that process to implement those policies. The objective of our program is to improve the management of biological diversity and the strengthening of traditional knowledge of peoples, indigenous peoples, and local communities. That's also cross-cutting, and it's based on the core human being and their of these communities, and that's why it'll always be part of our dialogue with the organizations. of the indigenous communities. I'm talking about Koika, Filak, and others. And we always work with them so that we incorporate not only through the countries, but directly one-to-one dialogue with those regional organizations and acknowledge the contribution of the traditional knowledge and cultural knowledge where there are indigenous peoples. Of course, they are the ones who have a very clear view of the balance and equilibrium, how to lead sustainable development in the region. So cooperation actions is part of our objective in midterm and short term and long term to achieve the objectives of CBD and the 2030 agenda. I recognize the different models, focuses, and the way they are implemented in the countries. The scope of the program is just to be in the framework of the coordination amongst member countries. Results of the quick assessment of biodiversity that we are making progress there. We are beginning to act and see the actions of scientists that will be participating in methodology for the platform. Is an intergovernmental platform on biodiversity and ecosystemic services. So with that element, it's important to understand that we are in the full execution of the program through that quick assessment of biodiversity of the Amazon region. That is a desire, all wish of the member countries. And now, with the establishment of the program, we are carrying it out, always with the support of German cooperation, GIZ, and also the Brazilian Agency of Cooperation. But the main thing is the contribution from the
Señor
Amazon
embajador,
countries. Mr. Ambassador, we thank you to conclude. It's time. Your time is up.
claro que sí.
Okay, I just want to mention one thing of the program. We have component 3, a strategic component, strategic action, that as a matter of fact, it includes the development of national actions to strengthen the national systems of protected areas and the OECM towards the protection of biodiversity, coordinated management of biodiversity in protected areas, and OECM, and it takes into account the results of technical cooperation networks in the region. In conclusion, I want to say that ODCA, with this program, we recognize the importance of OECM. When I say ODCA, is the 8 countries, okay? Some of them are more developed in this area. For example, Colombia, they already have a policy, a consolidated policy, but that's something the other countries can take advantage of. And also we see it as a practical instrument so that together with protected areas, we can promote conservation of the different levels of biodiversity, their ecosystems and their services, and suitable to protect species and also to protect indigenous peoples, local inhabitants of the big Amazon biomass. Thank you for the opportunity.
Muchas gracias, señor embajador, por contarnos todo este trabajo que está haciendo la OTA y que ha hecho por tantos años
Thank
en
you
favor
for the comments
del
of
bioma amazónico
what
y nacional, que
ODCA is doing
trabajamos
in
por
favor of the
conservar
Amazon biomass,
justamente
that
esta
we're trying to
cooperación entre
protect
los
precisely this
países
cooperation
de
amongst
los
the
ejes
8
de
countries,
cooperación
this
sur-sur, el
cooperation
tema de las
elements in South-South
ecosistemas nos
cooperation,
compete
also
y
the
cómo
topic of protected
Amazon
areas and
México
how
son unos
OECM
pilares
gather all these pillars
relacionados
as
con
well,
el
related to
post-2020
forests,
hídrico y por
water
supuesto
resources, and of
sostenible con
course, the
las
indigenous
comunidades
peoples
locales
and the
habitantes
local
de
communities
la
that
Amazonía,
inhabit the Amazon.
que están pues muy
And
alineados
they
con
are
los
very aligned with
objetivos del
all
programa
these
de diversidad
objectives of
biológica que este
biological
momento
diversity
ha tomado el
recently
proceso de
approved by
coordinación.
the 8 countries.
Muchísimas gracias,
So
señor embajador, por sus reflexiones,
thank you
por lo
very much
interesante que
for
usted
your
ha avanzado y cómo seguirá avanzando
report.
con la OTA. Quedamos muy atentos también al
We are
seguimiento del
very
observatorio regional que se
interested
está
in hearing the progress of the regional
haciendo en conjunto
observatory.
en todas nuestras organizaciones, nuestros
where we have a lot of contribute with giving information from the region. We have over 310 people connected in the different platforms from different countries. So we want to thank you for joining us. We invite you to leave your questions with us, and we like to try to answer later. So we invite Amber Hims from FAU, our Rome branch, who will be sharing with us a presentation on the application of the OECM criteria in the fishing sector. She'll be speaking in English, so we invite you to use interpretation at the bottom of your screen if you need to do so. Thank you very much, Amber. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Hola a todas. Tengo que compartir. Ok. ¿Vemos todos?
Sí, se ve.
Okay. Okay. Good morning to everyone, or afternoon if you are in other parts of the world. As you've seen from the other presentations so far, OECMs are starting to get a lot of attention, and I would like to share with you how FAO headquarters in Rome is getting involved. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Amber Himes Cornell. I'm a fisheries officer in the FAO Fisheries and Aquaculture Division, and I'm the division's focal point on area-based management. I want to get started by looking at the connection between fisheries and biodiversity conservation. Fisheries has a very important role in conserving biodiversity, and I think we can all agree that ultimately the fisheries and aquaculture sectors are really dependent on healthy ecosystems and biodiversity. Because of this, for decades, the fisheries management world has been trying to figure out how to make fisheries more sustainable so that they can contribute to biodiversity conservation, human well-being, food security, and livelihoods all at the same time. This is one of the reasons that SDG 14 was adopted. Its main goal is to reconcile the sustainable use of marine resources, social equity, and economic development. In line with that were Aichi Biodiversity Targets 6 and 11, and now their predecessor in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. The sustainability of natural resources has become extremely important and involves many actors working across different sectors, especially since the global population is growing and relying more and more on fisheries and aquaculture for food, nutrition, and livelihoods. Within this context, improved actions and synergies at the global and regional levels are essential. The connection between fisheries and biodiversity conservation is also present in the ecosystem approach to fisheries management that FAO is a big champion of. It's fundamental that this approach is ultimately aimed at delivering and reinforcing biodiversity conservation while filling the food gap at the same time. A key thing to highlight in all of this is that SDG 14, the various targets of the CBD, and ecosystem-based fisheries management all recognize the value of using area-based management tools for conservation of fish stocks and biodiversity. So why are OECMs important, especially for a sector like fisheries? The OECM concept represents a new opportunity for states and other organizations to recognize biodiversity conservation potential from a wide range of spatial management measures than ever before. OECM recognition provides states with an incentive to coordinate area-based fisheries management efforts across fisheries that take place within their exclusive economic zones, with area-based management tools being used in other sectors as well, like energy and defense. If managed through a marine spatial planning process, these formally established, spatially defined fisheries management measures can be integrated across competing sectors in order to reduce conflicts and help stakeholders in achieving a balance between the competing uses of the marine environment. OECMs represent an important opportunity to facilitate the involvement of people acting in sustainable use sectors, as well as in many communities. In particular, the OECM concept allows for a variety of sustainable use sectors to contribute to meeting global biodiversity targets through their own area-based management initiatives. This can result in two significant steps forward in achieving biodiversity conservation at a global level. First is we can mainstream biodiversity conservation objectives into the management of natural resource use. And second, we can ensure that the objectives of the sustainable use sectors are included in biodiversity conservation discussions and decisions. It's also important to emphasize that countries should be establishing marine protected areas and implementing initiatives that meet the OECM criteria in parallel if we're going to be successful at meeting these biodiversity conservation objectives. There are several advantages to this kind of a strategy. First, by creating networks of areas managed for conservation, we can result in a more extensive coverage of conservation efforts and make it a multi-sectoral effort. Teamwork from all sectors is the only way to effectively manage biodiversity and conserve it. Finally, by acknowledging the role that the sustainable use sector has in conservation, the needs of people are taken into consideration instead of being alienated. In addition, OECMs represent a value proposition where spatial management efforts in fisheries and other sectors are recognized as equally valuable to MPAs. Together, MPAs and OECMs represent a new and exciting opportunity to advance conservation in both the terrestrial and marine environments. Integration between fisheries sectors and across networks of MPAs and OECMs will be vital in helping to meet global biodiversity goals and needs. So do fisheries OECMs already exist? I'd say that the answer is yes. There are only two countries that have reported marine OECMs so far, and those are Canada and the Philippines. Canada has reported 57 fisheries closures, and the Philippines, while we don't know exactly the type of areas that they are, has reported over 100. Many area-based fisheries management measures are already meeting sustainability goals, and are likely able to meet the OECM criteria. We just need to figure out which areas qualify and which ones don't. It's really important for countries to remember that these kinds of areas already exist and are already included in fisheries management plans and processes in many, many countries. In addition, there are other existing measures that could meet the OECM criteria if countries only made small changes to them, such as adding additional technical measures, improving integration between multiple fisheries, or increasing monitoring and compliance. Despite the benefits of developing a network of MPA and OECMs, the term OECM has caused a lot of confusion, largely because the parties to the CBD did not develop and adopt official guidance early on for how to decide what they are. Although an official definition and criterion now exists for the last couple of years, many countries have still struggled with how to interpret and apply the concept in order to meet their Target 11 commitments. And now that the post-2020 framework is being negotiated, OECMs will carry forward in that as well, and countries will still have to try to figure out what are OCMs and what are not OCMs. If countries are going to be successful at meeting the more ambitious target that's currently in the post-2020 framework of 30% conservation by 2030, reporting a combination of both MPAs and OECMs in fisheries and other sectors is going to be very necessary. So what are we doing in FAO? The Fisheries and Aquaculture Division has been working hard to promote the recognition and inclusion of OECMs in the fisheries sector, and is prepared to provide support to its members in the identification, assessment, reporting, and monitoring of OECMs and MPAs as states prepare to move forward on the post-2020 framework. As the decade of the Aichi targets has come to an end, and the post-2020 framework is about to take off, various international efforts have been pursued to define, operationalize, and provide guidance on OECMs across multiple sectors. Numerous countries have begun thinking about the future of area-based conservation, and many have made significant progress, while others are still in the conceptual stage and looking for guidance on how to proceed. FAO's role in the CBD is to help countries meet their production needs while also keeping their commitments to conserving biodiversity. The Fisheries and Aquaculture Division can really help build the capacity of its members to report on how the fisheries sector is contributing to area-based conservation goals. And that's what the Fisheries and Aquaculture Division is aiming to do. We're trying to assist our members and regional fisheries bodies in the formulation of spatial management tools that have co-benefits for biodiversity. To do this, we have developed a program of work aimed at soliciting country expertise to help shape guidance for assessing fisheries OECMs, at the same time as guiding countries in the application of the OECM criteria through shared learning exchanges. So the mandate for this work came earlier this year in the 34th session of the Committee on Fisheries at FAO, where the FAO members explicitly noted the relevance of OECMs in achieving global targets and requested FAO to specifically produce and disseminate guidance for the fisheries sector on how to identify and implement OECMs. As a result, we've been focusing on 3 lines of work to help push this forward. We're drafting multiple volumes of guidance focused on helping countries move through the OECM assessment process. And we will be hosting regional workshops and directly helping countries to further provide hands-on support. So the guidance that we've been starting to produce or work on so far is ultimately going to end up in 2 different volumes. One of the volumes is going to be focused on how to prepare for an OECM assessment, what you really need to know before you start an assessment. And this will include information on the types of area-based fish management measures to consider, background information on OECMs and the CBD decision, the kinds of data that you need to think about collecting. We'll have a screening tool, and we'll walk through some of the opportunities and challenges for OECMs in the fisheries sector. The second part of the guidance is going to be focused on basically a how-to guide. How do you actually run through an assessment of a given area against the OECM criteria? So we'll be walking through steps for undertaking an OECM assessment, suggested expertise that you should be involving, the equivalence of the OECM criteria terminology in fisheries, how to interpret the criteria, some options for how you can recognize and report OECMs, and some best practices for monitoring them in the future. The shared learning workshops that we're going to be doing are going to go hands. Sí.
Le agradecemos ir cerrando la presentación. Muchas
It's almost time to finish. Thank you.
Okay. So we will also be having regional workshops that will have the objectives of supporting countries in the application of the criteria in a direct hands-on atmosphere, helping countries work through challenges, opportunities, and means that arise while they are identifying fisheries OECMs, and trying to synthesize lessons learned, as well as soliciting country expertise as we develop the guidance. So ultimately, my suggestion for everyone on this call that's involved in looking at fisheries OECMs, or really any kind of OECMs in their country, is that you need to keep in mind that a national process is important to ensure coherence and coordination among sectors. In the marine environment, a regional process under a regional seas convention or a regional fisheries body is really useful and can help catalyze the identification of OECMs by countries and enable sharing experiences and feedback between countries on their processes and the challenges they've encountered. It also helps in agreeing on thresholds. If we can all work together to come up with some common thresholds that countries can follow, we can try to apply the criteria both in a flexible manner and on a case-by-case basis, but having some sort of understanding about what the thresholds might be for the different criteria. In a marine environment, it's also going to be very important to promote intersectoral dialogues so that we can have more comprehensive marine spatial planning. OECMs as a process in terms of identifying them and reporting them can really spark a debate on enhancing the effectiveness of MPAs as well. And also really it's important to keep it practical and not try to get bogged down in the philosophical debate of what's an OECM and what's not, but really to try to look at things in a flexible way and on a case-by-case basis. And ultimately, we really just need to recognize that biodiversity discussions are likely to impact fisheries. So the fisheries sector can't afford to be left out. The fisheries sector has a lot to offer biodiversity conservation. Fisheries-related OECMs can help achieve their primary objectives of sustainable use, while also providing co-benefits for biodiversity. Additionally, they're particularly relevant to reconciling food security, biodiversity conservation, and sustainable development, and helping achieve a number of the SDGs alongside. A key message to leave you all with is that FAO is ready and willing to help countries and the fisheries sector navigate through this process so that we can all learn about it together. So I'll leave you with my email address so that if anybody has further questions, you can always send me an email and we can talk about it more. And I'm more than happy to talk with anybody from the countries in this region about how to help in this process. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias a ti, Amber, por contarnos.
Thank you so much, Amber, for telling us what FAO is doing, promoting the acknowledging of OECMs in the fishery sectors, because they are already conducting a conservation task. We know that there are points to be strengthened, like you mentioned, everything about monitoring and compliance, but it is very important to acknowledge the role of different sectors, different to conservation, that they are doing important conservation activities. It's very interesting to see what you mentioned. This is a national process as well. Clara already mentioned it. This is a national process that has been defined flexibly according to the criteria, legislations. And in these regional spaces, what we want is to motivate that decision, take into consideration that there are other countries that are more advanced, so that we can learn from these experiences, those lessons learned. And we thank you for the support from FAO to strengthen countries on these topics. So thank you so much. Now we are going to have Carolina Sofroni from the IAPA project in the Amazon. She's a technical consultant for this IAPA project, and she's going to tell us a little bit about the role of the project in acknowledging of Amazon biome in this discussion, and the decision 14.8 and the strengthening of capacities at the regional level. Go ahead, Carolina. You have 10 minutes. Let me remind you. I'm gonna send you a chat message to control. Thank you so much, and thank you, FAO, for this type of spaces. As it was mentioned before, we do have the opportunity of getting to know experiences and processes that are taking place globally and regionally. Today, like Claudia mentioned, we are going to tell you a little bit about how from this IAPA project, we have been supporting countries in the process of creating awareness on the criteria that have been defined in Decision 14.8 to share experiences and start thinking about inside countries how we understand the criteria and how the application can start. So the IAPA project is divided into two phases. The first phase was implemented from 2014 to 2019, and there were two scales, one in the Amazon biome and the other one in the landscapes. Then there were two landscapes that were prioritized to work on specific activities. So this second phase, to be implemented between 2020 and 2021, already started working or included Latin America and the Caribbean with work focus in the Amazon biome and these other two prioritized landscapes. So within the framework, or because of the decision 14.8 that Clara already mentioned, where the decision it's for the definition for an effective conservation measure is, and the global criteria that are defined, the IAPA project started having these capacity building spaces. One first space for the Amazon biome, a second space at the Latin America and the Caribbean scope, another one in the Colombian Amazon, and then a series of webinars where we have conveyed to participants what the other effective conservation measures are about. Okay, so let me bring these maps in the Latin America, the Caribbean, and what types of OECMs were identified by countries, just so that we can see that there is a great variety of possible OECMs and they all depend from the country. So for example, we exclude indigenous territories, Cuba, so we have these development areas as possible OECM, urban ecological parks in other countries, in Nicaragua, Ramsar, and then we have interurban ecological corridors. So each country defines what types of areas can be considered as OMECs. Can you please silence your mics, people who have them open? So depending on the context of different countries. So in the framework of these, they have been identified which possible OECMs or which could be identified as OECMs. And because of these workshops, then OECMs effectively have the opportunity, or they are areas that have several opportunities. They could recognize conservation beyond protected areas, acknowledge and incorporate different stakeholders and governance models on conservation. So this is an OECMs could have public-private governance, joint governance. So there are different types of governance in these OECMs. Their objectives are comparable with the sustainable use of biodiversity. They don't require strict conservation processes as the protected area. For an area to be recognized as an OECM, it requires consultation and consent process by the stakeholders. It is a very important opportunity to increase ecological representativity and landscape through protected area networks. And they can also support conservation process in these buffering zones in protected areas, but they also contribute to comply with goals related to biodiversity and climate change and 2030 agenda, that is the Sustainable Development Goals agenda. There's a lot of noise in the call. Well, within these discussion spaces, there are also challenges, and how to incorporate other sectors in these dialogues to be able to have an incidence in the other processes in land or organizing, so that these stakeholders have a voice, and how OECMs are integrated in the national protected areas, that they have adequate financing, and how they can protect to strengthen local governments so that they can promote and have an incentive to recognize OECMs, and their incentives are for effective management throughout the time, and how to include indigenous peoples and local communities to identify and report OECMs. Well, we have these two publications, and here we have all those results and the discussions that we had within the framework of these processes, dialogue processes with countries. And here we would like to tell you about this exercise to identify potential OECMs that we have been developing within the framework of the project, following the methodology mentioned by Clara, that is a draft by the IUCN, to be able to identify OECMs in different places. We have specifically worked on this first part in red. This is the tool for visualization. This will provide a general landscape, a broad scale, what those potential OECMs could be in the territory. This was done for one of the prioritized landscapes in the project. This is the south landscape. This is the border between Bolivia, Brazil, and Peru, and we have it here in red in the map. This is the south landscape, and throughout what the methodology calls the screening tool, applying for tests, you can know if it is a potential OECM or not. When we talk about potential OECMs, those are areas that because of secondary information may comply with the OECM criteria. However, governance authorities have not applied criteria as such. So there are 4 tests. The first one for this, I mean, so that this area is not a protected area, it does not overlap with the protected area. The second text is that it has delimited boundaries that are governed and managed so that there could be in situ conservation and that this conservation process can remain in the long term, that this has conservation results in the long term. There is this geographical information analysis, and after doing so, there were 714 potentials, and the types of ECM, they vary according to different countries. So in Bolivia, we have urban ecological parks, we have biodiversity key areas, we have collectors associations, indigenous territories. In Brazil, we have legal reserves, we have biodiversity key areas for diversity, we have network projects, and Peru, more OECMs were identified. We have conservation concessions, ecotourism concessions. We also have TICAs, TICCA, which are the peasant originary indigenous territories, and we also have forest product concessions. We have a total of 784 OECMs in different categories or governance projects. So here in this map, we can see different OECMs in the south landscape. You can see here we have protected areas such as Antuporus National Park, Sabual Chambles, and Maburipi, and in orange we see the conglomerates that we have identified as possible OECMs. And this map is really important because here we can see the role of OECMs in collective processes, ecological processes in the landscape. Well, this is what I wanted to show you super quickly about how from the IAPA project we have been advancing to support countries to identify OECMs. So in the future, we'd like to have a similar map to the one that we built for the South landscape, but for the Amazon biome, where we're gonna have a greater view of the potential of other effective area-based conservation measures for biome, and then we're also building a tool so that we can apply this screening tool or that, yeah, this quick evaluation tool so that is available for all projects, stakeholders, communities who'd like to identify whether their area may or may not be an OECM so that they can go to the next point that be to apply criteria with governance authorities in each one of the areas. Well, thank you so much, Claudia. I think that I was within my allotted time and I pass on the floor to Marcela. Thank you, Carolina. Thank you so much for your presentation, for telling us about this experience in the Amazon biome and this capacity building process, along with many partners, many projects in the region. So it is important to highlight those alliances because this is about collaboration between different sectors and stakeholders. So thank you so much, Carol, for that presentation. Let me tell you that we have had more than 370 people connected in our platforms, many places in the region, many other places in the world. So we really thank you for being here today. I would like to ask our panelists, we're short of time, so we have some questions in the chat, we have some questions in the Q&A section there. So if you could please help us answering questions through the chat and through the Q&A so that we can advance. And now I'm going to pass on the floor to Marcela Santamaria, so from the civil society in Colombia, and she will tell us about her experience and applying these criteria. Thank you, Marcela. Thank you, Claudia, and thank you everyone for being here and for this space. to be able to show some of the results that we have obtained through applying the OECM criteria in the Colombian context. This project started in June 2019. It is financed by the small Jeff program. It's UNDP. So we have the Humboldt Institute, we have Natura Foundation, and we have the GIZ and others, including, for example, the IUCN, and we'll be closing the project in 1 month. Next month, the project will be closed. So I would like to start by telling you that, as many of you know, Colombia is a country with a lot of biological and cultural diversity. Keeping in mind that close to 34% of its territory is in indigenous African descendant and peasant territories, the OECM context and the framework is so important and so relevant to get to acknowledge so many initiatives that we have in the territory for decades, and they are configured and they have more particular motivations. Colombia is part of the CBD and has joined this framework. So these stakeholders, local governments and private stakeholders are so important to be kept in mind within these conservation efforts. This is specifically valid when we keep in mind that in Colombia, the national system for protected areas is focused mainly on public governance and sometimes private governance, and this includes the national and regional scope. So OECMs allow getting to local spheres. So from the project, we advance with 3 main topics. There were many other things that were done, but there were 3 main things related. The first one was to identify the potential OECMs. We had the mapping and the potential cases. They were selected with the support and the experience of partners in the project. And we had a small database built that collect 800 potential OECMs identified in Colombia. These initiatives started in Colombia in 2014 in the National Congress on Protected Areas. Then we went to the second stage, assessment. Criteria were applied with representatives from the areas and with this local approach, and eight uh, and 8 plans were selected so that they would implement strengthening plans according to those visualized needs when criteria were applied. Lastly, there was this national roadmap to report OECMs from Colombia to the WCMC. And also, we continued advancing, including the OECM to the World Database prior verification process. This process we are advancing very much, and we know the closing is coming. So criteria were applied for 28 cases, and they collected the 4 types of governance so that they would make diversity in configurations visible. So that was done with alliances we had with the IAPA, with Magdalena Cauca, and the other forest institutions. The methodology is participative. There were several orienting questions that were linked to criteria and the components according to the IUCN guidelines. Therefore, those questions helped understand whether OECM was consistent or not and complied with these criteria or not. Here on the right, you see the publication that was recently done in June this year. This collects this participative methodology, the reporting, and the context of OECM, the conceptual framework. And here you can find this link. this work and this methodology has also come, we have had different trainings with the country and with other countries that are part of the project with the GIZ. Once the criteria were replicated, there was this analysis of such criteria, and then we had this traffic light system. We were able to identify three possibilities. One, for the area complied with the criteria, and it could be reported with the global database if the representatives wanted to. Second, if it was necessary to advance, to strengthen prior to complying with criteria and then go to the global database. And three, the area was not an OECM because of any reason, because it did not comply with one or several criteria. The third point, and one of the greatest achievements, was to adopt the reporting roadmap, a national roadmap. So this was along with the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development in Colombia and PPPD. They will always send the verification to see whether the information from OECM is consistent to what the country knows, and also with the small donations according to the IUCN guidelines, so that these conservation initiatives are visible. Something very important. So this is practical, this is simple, and several stakeholders can participate. So therefore, within the Ministry of the Environment, they are revised and verified with verifiers with different strengths and experiences, cases I'm talking about. These OECMs are expected to be included in the territorial planning and for them to have access to national resources so that they can continue contributing with the work that they have been doing so far. The good news is that this month we will have the platform, the protected platform. We will have the first two Colombian OECMs reported. This is Andaquies Park in the Amazon, 26,000 hectares. This is between the Mayor's Office and Tierra Viva Foundation and the Natural Reserve with 44 hectares. This is located close to Bogota in El Rosal. All right, here we have two small examples to view this methodology. This is the Salto Topacio Natural Reserve. This is in the north of Colombia. This is called the Montes de Maria, the area. So the AMUSI Association have this tropical dry forest conservation. This is one of the most threatened ecosystems in Colombia where water is very scarce. So this association, this is women's association in Bolivar, in San Isidro. The motivation is to have the rights as women so that they have productive autonomy and they can decide on their lives. In addition, they concentrate their work on sustainable production, and they want to conserve basins in this area where I said that water is scarce. So they received a grant and they focused their efforts on good practices, water management, and good practices, productive practices, and governance, and the process by the community and those who depend on water for their well-being. Currently, we're starting this reporting process as OECM. First, to the roadmap that I had told you, 15 hectares of this tropical forest. Let me give you the second example. This is Playa Rica Conservation Area. This is located in the Amazon of Colombia. Here, the name of the association is ASOPAP. This is a Playa Rica village inhabitants. They have this humid tropical forest and they have this governance exerted by them as an organized community through this association. Their motivation, their main motivation, or several of their motivation, is to build an economic system that does not depend on coke in a department as Putumayo, where coke plantations are extensive. Well, they also want to have food security to sustainable fishery in Putumayo River, as we see here in the map, and to have these emblematic species so that they can have this conservation process and looking for this nature tourism so that they can have financial sustainability and so that they are not linked to drug productions. So there are 24 families. They are the ones who handled the area and they focused here. You see here on the map, they focused on preparing and the implementation process of consensus agreements and the handling of these more than 600 hectares. And this tourism project that will be presented and, like, as I said, the financial sustainability. This case is also to be published. As I said, 496 hectares of tropical humid forest. So they are completely involved in this conservation process in this area of the country. To finish, I would like to give you 4 very specific messages. OECM frameworks represents a tool for formal acknowledgement beyond conservation, uh, beyond the protected areas. These initiatives have not been acknowledged, they have not been made visible, so it is very important to have these OECM frameworks because they have an opportunity of being recognized in this process. Important and not necessarily obvious. OECMs should not have the same requirements as protected areas because they have different contexts and they have voluntary efforts and local efforts that may be different. So there are criteria, we know there's a definition, and we know that it's not the same thing as protected areas. This is important to be kept in mind. OECMs always should not only be identified, but it is important to support their strengthening so that they can keep positive results for conservation in the long term. Many cases, they have been voluntary with very little resources, probably private resources, communities, or shared governance. They are completely committed with these conservation efforts. Lastly, I'd like to say, just as it has been said before, OECMs are key for the biodiversity framework post-2020 goals. They complement, they contribute with different actions to protected areas, but they are articulated in this landscape that aims at being more resilient as time goes by. Thank you so much. This is the team. If you should require any additional information, you can log in resnatur.org.co website. Claudia, I think I was within time. Sort of, Marcela, but it was so interesting as everyone's presentations. It was very hard to cut people, presenters, because those nice experiences that you tell us about women, these communities, I think that they're worth listening to them, recognizing them, and they help us support these processes. We have so many questions, very interesting questions from the audience. So we are going to have to collect them because time is running by. So we're going to try to answer these questions, but not all of them right now. There's one question that has been repeated by different people in the webinar. Carolina, what benefits do communities and different stakeholders, what benefits do they have when they report beyond being acknowledged? So I think that unfortunately we have time to answer this question because presentations were all so interesting. They were very focused. They gave us light and we want to keep on learning, but we have little time. So go ahead, Carolina, with this question and we will collect other questions. If you registered, we're going to send through email the answers to these questions, and we will have future activities in the region. So go ahead, Caro. Thank you so much, Claudia. Yes, as benefits in the framework of different discussions that we have had with different stakeholders, one of the comments is the possibility of having this armor in their territories before the threats like mining, hydrocarbons, they're in their territories. So beyond what the person, beyond reporting an OECM, is that benefit that stakeholders see, that is to be able to armor their territories before threats. So those benefits must be stipulated and defined by each one of the countries, those incentives that many participants asked. What are the incentives for me to be acknowledged as an OECM? There is not just one answer that must be analyzed and discussed in each one of the national contexts. So I believe that none of the panelists could actually provide a specific answer about this question because it will depend on the discussions in each one of the countries.
Muchas gracias, Carolina.
Thank
Sí.
you, Carolina. Thank you, Claudia. This is a process that is just beginning. And this is just a little provocation. Let's say it is a little starting point. So we're coming to the end of our webinar, but we cannot close without saying thank you to our panelists so that they can help us learn the challenges and identifying OECMs. We know that this is important for biodiversity goals post-2020, but part of that acknowledging of other stakeholders who are already doing conservation, productive sectors, different communities, governments, local governments that are conducting those conservation processes. It's important to keep them in mind, raise their voice through the OECM identification process. We thank all attendees for their participation, for their questions, those who followed us in the social networks. We had more than 470 people connected from the whole region. So we know that this is something that will continue moving. And by FAO, well, we have all the support and the willingness to continue supporting these topics in the region. Thank you very much for being here and have a great